Hello and welcome to Twist List. Today we are looking at 9 last official shots of wars. It is the most shameful aspect of our species that we have a bent to murder. Step back from the history book and ask yourself, why are all these wars in here? Why are there so many? What is the common denominator of all casi bellorum throughout history? It is a depressing subject, but this list looks at the official endings of 9 wars, listed in no particular order, in an attempt to illustrate the relief that must have followed them. Benjamin Franklin once said, "There has never been a good war or a bad peace." In this sense, perhaps all wars have had a happy ending, which is that they do end. This list is unintentionally America-centric, but there is certainly plenty of ground left to cover in subsequent lists. The 5th spot on the list is occupied by 6. The Apache Wars constitute a small portion of the American Indian Wars, which are usually dated from 1850 to about 1924. In truth, the war lasted from the 1620s, off and on for 3 centuries. European settlers very rarely thought of the native peoples as equal to themselves, and the government practically never did. Because the Indian tribes could never make a lasting and universal peace among themselves, they could not form a sufficiently strong army to defeat the settlers. The largest alliance was probably that of the Six Nations, formed in 1722, incorporating the Seneca, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, Cayuga, and Tuscarora. The Apache nations fought major engagements against the United States Army from about 1849 to 1886, but the war lingered on until 1924, by which time the Apache were completely subjugated. The last recorded armed action between Apache warriors and the U.S. Army occurred on January 9, 1918, when a cavalry detachment of about 30 was alerted by a farmer of mutilated livestock near his ranch. The cavalry sent some of its men to the top of a ridge to scout for Indians, and 30 of them were seen about a quarter of a mile away. They were Yaqui Indians, allied with the Apache, and the cavalry rode out to hunt them down. The Indians hid in a boulder field on the ridge and ambushed the soldiers with rifle fire, then began falling back as the cavalry pursued them. Only
Number
1
4
man,
on the list,
an Indian,
US
was
West
killed.
Wisconsin.
The corporal
Many
who fired
scholars
on
have
him has
cited
not
the
been
war of
recorded,
northern
but he
aggression,
managed to
as
hit
the
the
South
Indians
likes to
as he
call
was
it,
running
as the
between
first
rocks.
modern war.
There were minor
It was
hostile
no longer
encounters
impossible
such
to
as this
fire
between
at
the
one
US
another
and
in the
various
rain,
other
since
tribes for a
percussion
few more
caps are not
years,
exposed
but very
gunpowder,
few.
if any,
The war
of
saw
them
the
resulted in
introduction of the
shots
first
fired.
machine gun.
This was
the
the
last
Gatling
known shot
and the
fired
5x
compete
Oregon
against any
rifles.
of the Apache
The
or their
American
allies.
population
At the time totaled 31.5 million, and at least 620,000 men died during those 4 years and 4 months, 2% of the nation. Today, there are about 316 million people in the United States, 2% of which is 6,320,000. List versus American readers must find it very difficult to imagine the grief America's population suffered because of its civil war. Because the war was fought in such close confines, the concept of gaining ground did little to bring about a conclusion. If Washington, D.C., or Richmond had been successfully captured, a whole army would have been only weeks away from coming to its aid. The only real goal of the war for either side was to kill as many of the enemy as possible until they gave up. The South never had a chance. Communication left a lot to be desired back then, and when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on 9 April, 1865, it was not until August 2 that the word reached the Shenandoah. The Confederate Navy was based primarily out of Liverpool, England, to ensure that the Union could not nullify it. The Shenandoah was the most fearsome ship they had. Her orders on the outbreak of war were to sink or capture Union mercantile vessels, and she did so to 38 of them, without losing a single crewman to combat. Most of these prizes were whaling ships, and on June 28, 1865, in the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia, the Shenandoah sank or captured 10 vessels of the Union war anyone had ever seen. The last of these was the general notion
which was
that there was
fired
glory to be had in
boarded,
fighting and
stripped
dying
of all
for patriotism
valuable
or for any
cargo,
sense of
then
duty.
burned into the sea
Until
off the
then,
Diomede
warfare
Islands.
was conducted
Just over
according
a
to
month
the
later,
classical
the
principles
Shenandoah
of troop
parleyed with
movements
the
on the
British ship
field.
and learned of Lee's
Everyone
surrender.
moved as one. It
Whether
immediately
battalion,
struck its colours and
regiment,
sailed
or
for
company,
England to surrender,
the
where its
belligerent
crew
crew
would
approached
not
with
be in
an eye.
range and fired until one side broke and ran. That sounds idiotic, but it lasted for millennia, until Hiram Maxim figured out how to make the truly modern machine gun. The British and Germans both had the gun in World War I, but neither side's military theory had progressed beyond classical formations. On July 1, 1916, the British sent 13 divisions of their 4th Army directly into the Germans' machine gun fire, and 19,240 men were cut in half as they walked calmly forward. It was, perhaps, the single most crystalline moment of insanity warfare has yet produced on Earth. That battle, the Battle of the Somme, was an utter stalemate. Those men died for not the slightest gain. 2 years later, with the Germans and their allies exhausted from fighting just about everyone else in the entire world except America, the latter finally joined in against them, and the Germans could no longer hold out. They surrendered, and all sides signed an armistice that went into effect on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. French time. In the town of Ville-sur-Seine, Belgium, a Canadian named George Price was shot through the heart by a German sniper just 3 minutes before the armistice would take effect. 2 minutes later, about 150 miles to the south, American Private Henry Nicholas John Gunther and his squad were approaching a German machine gun roadblock in Chaumont-de-Vent-Damvilliers, France. The Germans called in English for them to stop, explaining that in 60 seconds the war would be over. Gunther had been demoted from sergeant months earlier and wanted to regain his honor, so he charged them on foot, though his men shouted for him to come back. He fired 1 or 2 shots from his rifle, and the 2 German squads opened fire for 2 full seconds, nearly cutting him in half across the breast. At the second spot is 4. The 97th Infantry Division did not see action in Europe until March 1945, with plenty of fighting still to be done. The Russians would not initiate the Battle of Berlin for another month, and that alone would result in about 180,000 dead. The American Dominic Motzeta was in Baker Company of the 387th Regiment of the 97th, and they joined in the reduction of some 400,000 Wehrmacht and Nazis, supplemented by World War I veterans and the Hitler Youth, in the Ruhr River Valley. This encirclement netted about 300,000 German prisoners of war, most of whom finally grew tired of fighting and realized that the end was inevitable. Anti-Nazis tried to surrender Düsseldorf to the Americans to spare it from bombing, but the SS, true to form, quelled this rebellion and killed most of the people involved. The Americans had been contacted, though, and Düsseldorf was spared. By the end of April, the 97th had moved through southwestern Germany into Czechoslovakia, fighting severe urban battles and in thick forests, and liberating Flossenburg concentration camp, until they received the ceasefire of May 7 at 11:55 p.m. that night, while on patrol about 3 kilometers (2 miles) northwest of Glenavise. Motzeta was shot after a German was destroyed, vowing to fight on until either every single fired back on the Japanese islands was dead, or the invaders desist from the tree. When the Soviets declared war on the European theater of the Japanese Army's most senior officers set about declaring martial law to stop anyone from negotiating peace. Almost exactly 11 hours later, downtown Nagasaki was obliterated and Emperor Hirohito declared the unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan. Several thousand Japanese still resisted this announcement for a few days. It took until August 15 for the declaration of the cessation of the hostilities to reach all American warships in the Pacific. The last shot of the entire Second World War was not a bullet but a torpedo, fired from the submarine Torsk off Kasumiko, north of the southwest Honshu coast. The Torsk, commanded by Bafford Llewellyn, had been hunting military cargo ships and sighted one escorted by an armed frigate. It fired on and sank the frigate first, but the cargo ship was shielded by coral reefs and escaped. About 1 hour later, at midday on the 14th, a second frigate entered the area and dodged the Torsk's torpedo. The Torsk then fired again, this time the newly designed, electrically propelled Mark 27 torpedo, which homed in on its target via sonar, and broke the ship into pieces. Several more armed vessels and airplanes converged on the area, and the Torsk remained underwater for over 7 hours before escaping. The next morning, Commander Llewellyn relayed to the ship that Japan had given up. The deadliest war in human history had come to its end. Number 4 on the list is choke pear. These instruments were used in oral and rectal formats, and in the larger vaginal one. They are forced into the mouth, rectum or vagina of the victim, and they're expanded by force of the screw to the maximum aperture of the segments. The inside of the cavity in question is irremediably mutilated, nearly always fatally so. The pointed prongs at the end of the segments serve better to rip into the throat, the intestines or the cervix. The oral pair was often inflicted on heretical preachers, but also on lay persons guilty of unorthodox tendencies. The rectal pair awaited passive male homosexuals, and the vaginal one women guilty of sexual union with Satan or his familiars. Pictured above is a version of the choke pair called the pair of anguish. At the third place we have lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler was essentially a ladle on the end of a handle. The top half of the sphere could be removed and the lower half was filled with molten metal, boiling oil, boiling water, pitch or tar. The perforated top half was then reattached. Shaking or flicking the sprinkler towards the victim showered him or her with the boiling contents of the ladle. The victim had, of course, been pinioned in advance. At the second spot is breast ripper. This item was used both as a punitive and an interrogational device. Punitively, it was used red hot to mark the breast of unmarried mothers. In an inquisitory nature, it was used on condemned women, convicted of heresy, blasphemy, adultery, self-induced abortion, erotic white magic and any other crime that the inquisitors selected. The claws were used, either cold or heated, on a female's exposed breasts, rendering them into bloody pulps. A variation was called the spider. This consisted of clawed bars which protruded from the wall. A woman was pulled alongside the bars until her breasts were torn away. And finally, at number 1, crocodile shears. The crocodile shears was an instrument of torture used in late medieval Europe and typically reserved for regicides, those who attempted, and, perhaps, succeeded, to assassinate the king. The shears were made of iron and were based upon the concept of pincers, but, instead of standard jaws or blades, crocodile shears ended in a pair of hemi-cylindrical blades that, when closed together, formed a long, narrow tube. The insides of the blades were generously lined with teeth or spikes. After being heated red hot, the crocodile shears were applied to the erect penis, which, once exposed to sufficient tension, was torn from the prisoner's body, or at the very least leading to severe arterial bleeding. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, then please hit the subscribe button.